Hello, class. For this lecture, we're going to be talking about the introduction to a research project. And I thought the best way to do this would be to use an example, a recent example of something published by the business department, and then go through kind of the best practices and what the content should be from your book. And just see if it's present in this research paper and what it actually looks like within the paper. There's a couple of things to keep in mind though as we're going through this and we're doing this. There's templates for a good introduction. There's a lot of different thought on what comprises a good introduction. I think there are certain elements that need to be present when you're doing an introduction, and those are outlined pretty well on page 105 of your text. But there is a bit of subjectivity to it. It is a bit of an art. Some people like a longer, flowing, more encompassing and descriptive introduction. Some people say, hey, look, just get to the point. I'm not reading a fiction story here. I'm not on the beach reading this. I want to get to what's important and then move on. So there's a couple different approaches to it. I probably fall somewhere in between that. I believe in building to the problem, or not even building to the problem, but building up to the thesis statement, building up to here is why I am doing this, or here is the purpose of the paper. But in order to do that, I need to bring the reader a little bit up to speed about what the problem is, about what's been done, about what some of the other research looks like, and about where some of the gaps in the literature are. So here's where things aren't quite complete, and that's the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing. I'm doing the research or presenting the research that I'm presenting. So, again, I think it's one of those things that comes with doing. The more you do it, the better you're going to get at it. The more you read, some really good introductions, the better you're going to get at it if you kind of copy those styles. So what we'll do again for this one is, this is just an article that was recently published. We'll go through it and we'll look and see if we have some or all of the elements outlined in your text on page 105. The first thing I want to point out is the abstract. And for right now, we're going to, especially for this class, we're going to stay away from the abstract. An abstract really is there to summarize the entire research project. So you need the methodologies, right? You need to have, or the methods, I should say, you need to have collected data. You need to have identified participants. You need to have determined what type of statistical analysis you're going to do. You needed to perform that statistical analysis, and then you need to have some kind of outcome of what was done. And for what we're doing in this class, we're just not going to have all those elements, so an abstract doesn't necessarily make sense. So we're going to skip that right now, but when eventually you move into the capstone phase of your studies, you will need to do an abstract because you will have all those elements in place, and you could summarize them all within about 250 to 300 words. Okay, so here's the introduction against 2 columns, and it's about 1.5 to 2 pages long. That's the end of the introduction there. So about 1.5 pages, 2 columns each, which roughly translates to about 2 pages. So I'm going to look at the model for putting together introduction, and I'm going to see if I could find these elements here. So what I do, I'll highlight some areas here, and I'll read them out loud, and I'll explain why that constitutes one of the elements you see on page 105. So the first one, it says state the research problem. And that's number 1 in your text. And sometimes it's easy just to kind of flow from the problem. So you could say to yourself, okay, what's the problem that I'm looking at? And then once you have that, and once you dive into the literature and read, starting from that point tends to be relatively easy. So just if you look at that's not what I wanted to do. Okay, I'm not going to be able to sign out of that, but let me go ahead and do this instead. Not what I was thinking I was going to be able to do. I thought I could just highlight very easily, but okay. So as textbook technology supplements become more prolific in higher education as complementary tools to assist student learning, it's crucial to okay. So what we're saying there is, look, when you buy textbooks, the publishers of those books provide a lot of supplemental tools for the instructor to use. What are those supplemental tools? Well, things like there's LearnSmart, there's interactive quizzes, there's interactive homework assignments, and these are all on the computer. There's PowerPoint presentations. There's a whole bunch of things that a teacher's manual and teaching notes. There's a whole bunch of things that textbook companies supply to the instructor, almost an overwhelming amount. And they're becoming more and more common in higher education. And the reason they're there is to hopefully help with student learning outcomes. Okay, so let me continue what we wrote here. To date, this evaluative research is still in its infancy, and existing studies are rife with complication. So what I'm saying there is, there's a lot of these technologies, but they need to be evaluated for their usefulness and their impact on student learning. So right now, that's not necessarily the case. We really don't know the impact that all of these technologies from the publisher have on student learning outcomes. Actually highlighted a little more. I should have kind of stopped here. So there's the problem. The problem is we have a lot of these TTS, textbook technology supplements. We're not sure which ones actually have an impact on student learning. Okay, so there's really me or us in this department stating what the research problem is. So as a reader, within the first few sentences, I know, okay, this is what the gist of what's going on here is. Then it says review studies that have addressed the problem and indicate deficiencies in those studies. Okay, now I do that, I keep saying we did that a lot over the next few paragraphs. So, textbook publishers offer testimonials. They have their brochures, they have their pamphlets saying how great they are, but these are largely non-peer-reviewed case studies, okay, in the sales literature. On the academic front, there was one study done by these two gentlemen here, Timmerman and Krupke, who they really looked at everything, and they found that there was a big, that really they helped undergraduate students in performance in traditional lecture classes, which is great. They looked at, I think, 26 studies or something. The problem was the study was criticized because there was too many things they were examining, including media richness, students' field of study, publication time, and that could all cloud the impact of the technology. As a result, there was some study that says, let's just look at these in isolation. Let's look at the component parts in isolation. And let's not look at everything together. Okay, so I stated what the problem was. I looked at a few studies initially that said, look, we can look at all these things as a whole, but that's not going to do us any good. That clouds the impact of the effectiveness. So let's move then to, there have been a few studies that isolated particular components of this technology. So you see the transition here. That's another part, that the transition from one paragraph to another. Here I'm kind of alluding that we need to look at these on an individual basis, these TTS on an individual basis. So I do that. A few studies have been isolating the components. One did LearnSmart on a standalone. LearnSmart is an adaptive learning tool where you read the chapter, and then as you're reading, it asks you questions. And if you get the questions right, it assumes you know it, and it moves you on to the next section. If it doesn't, it takes you to more information on that particular topic, and it keeps doing that until it feels like you have learned the subject matter. It's really an algorithmic adaptive technology. And that's really what we're studying here. So here's a study that isolated that technology. Here's one instance where Gerhard conducted a post-test only experiment. Here's where the students were seniors and juniors. And here's where the result of the study. Now, we may have gone a little far here with reporting the results of those studies. because really it says what were some of the deficiencies in those studies. But we report the results because these results said that there was no differences in exam scores. So there's no differences in performance of students who use this technology. That went against what our hypothesis was because we didn't feel that way. Here's another one where there was a pre-test, post-test, which was a much better study of physiology and anatomy students. Their results said no significant difference. Okay? And you can tell there's no difference when this p-value is above a 0.05. So if this is above a 0.05, it's showing that there's no significance in the study. This p-value is way above a 0.05. So there was no difference in pre-test, post-test, student grades, retention. This research also concluded that the amount of time spent in LearnSmart application did not impact student performance. So these two studies that isolated LearnSmart said there was no impact on performance. Again, that was going against what we thought we would see. So we put them in there, but what I found most interesting was this section here, that 2 institutions involved in the study demonstrated improvement in post-test scores, suggesting that there was some benefit. But where was that coming from? So that number one said to us, no, keep going with your study. There may be something there that's significant. And don't forget, the first study was upperclassmen, right? The one that found no difference. The second study that found no difference was physiology and anatomy students. Okay, so is it maybe something in this population where this LearnSmart doesn't help, but down here there was something going on where it did help the students? So then we go on to make our guess or approximation as to why that might be. And we said there's a couple of reasons. Number one, we had a lot of first-generation college students. You know, up here you're talking about upperclassmen and physiology and anatomy students who tend to be a little more prepared for college going in. They took tougher classes when they were in high school. That's typically what we see. And then more than half of our students receive Pell Grants, meaning they come from lower socioeconomic households. Okay, so those two things right there are very important. So this ties into the significance of our study, right? So notice how we're building this narrative as we go along. We said, here's what the problem is. Here's some studies that looked at everything, but people are saying that's not the way to do it. Okay, so let's look at things in isolation. We found 2 studies that isolated LearnSmart, which is what we were looking at, but they found no significant difference. Then we said to ourselves, why do we think there was no significant difference? Maybe because the grade and the course of study students were taken. Also, maybe because our students are highly first-generation students and lower socioeconomic status. Maybe this LearnSmart technology can help that student population. And then we go on to describe why we feel that way. First-generation college students have been shown to be underprepared academically, lack in study time management skills, lower self-efficacy. That's compared to their non-first generation counterparts. Low socioeconomic students demonstrate higher anxiety and attention problems. In addition, SES students, I'm getting some. I think I'm screwing the technology up here with so many lines. Okay, so I'm going on to describe why we think first generation college students and lower socioeconomic status students might benefit most from this LearnSmart technology. Okay, so let's look at it on page 105. We stated the research problem, reviewed studies that have addressed the problem. We indicate deficiencies in those studies. Now, we didn't really go ahead and explicitly say the 2 studies, the one where juniors and seniors and the one with physiology and anatomy students were bad because of this, but we went on to say, here's why we think our study is different than those. They did theirs, they didn't find a difference. Ours is different than those. So we're really identifying deficiencies there, and we identify deficiencies in studying everything all at once and with the literature that the book companies are giving us. Advance the significance of the study for particular audiences. Okay, so we're doing that here. Who are our audiences? Well, it could be administrators in college. It could be some faculty within college. It says if you have a lot of first-generation college students, if you have a lot of lower socioeconomic status college students, this may be beneficial to you. So that's the audience. So it's easy to see this is who we are talking about. Heck, it can even be for college students themselves who fall within those categories if they want to be successful in college. So we've identified the audience, and then ultimately you have to state the purpose statement. What is your thesis statement? And we always try to make this very clear. This study was initiated to examine the effectiveness of LearnSmart application, specifically for college freshmen skewed towards lower socioeconomic status and first-generation student enrolled in an introductory level business course. And then we go on again, this population may come to school lacking, and some of the other things that we have. And then we talk about how we're going to do that. And it seems like I froze up again, but the effectiveness of this was gauged through student performance on pre-test, post-test, and aggregate exam scores throughout the entire term. That's the purpose of this study. The purpose is to examine the effectiveness of this LearnSmart application to this population because we feel this. And then you can't see it, and for some reason my screen has frozen up on me, so I can't go down. We state two hypotheses, and if you're doing a quantitative study, typically you will state a hypothesis, two hypotheses, and really what it's saying is, without getting too specific, it's a statement of what you expect, but you state it as a null or a negative. So hypothesis one was we should see no difference, right? If this thing doesn't really work the way we think it does, we will see no difference between pre-test, post-test scores in the grades in the class that got the LearnSmart technology. Our null hypothesis number two was we will see no difference in aggregate exam scores between the class that gets the LearnSmart and the class that doesn't get the LearnSmart. So again, you state it as a negative, and then you say we can reject the null. If you see a difference, then you can say we reject the null. We did see a difference in pre-test, post-test scores. We did see a difference in aggregate exam scores. Again, we're not proving anything beyond a doubt. We're not saying this absolutely positively works for this population. We're saying, look, we can reject these null hypotheses based on what we saw, but we need further research done. So again, this is just an example of an introduction. Again, it was something that we published recently, so we're kind of proud of that. And when I went through this and looked at those the 5 elements that should be present on page 105, we did a pretty decent job of covering those. So when you write your introduction this week, and then when you improve upon them next week from the feedback you receive, keep these things in mind. Also keep in mind, you don't want one-sentence paragraphs. Paragraphs should be well-developed with one main idea, right? One main idea, and then everything else after that supports whatever that main idea is. And then if you get really good, you can come up with a transition sentence or two at the end of a paragraph that leads you into the next paragraph. And I think that's something that we did good here. If you read through this introduction, you can see how the last paragraph is kind of setting up the next paragraph, and it flows a lot easier. If you start having a bunch of totally disconnected ideas and thoughts, it's not good for the reader, and it's hard for the reader to follow and see where it is that you're going. So try to transition from paragraph to paragraph in a smooth way, and of course stay away from one-sentence paragraphs. Each paragraph should have a main idea, and then supporting examples and a little bit of your analysis in there to help support that main idea. Okay, so that's the model for introduction. Please read over this. Start putting together your introduction. When you submit it, I'll give you some feedback on that. We can refine it then the next week, and I'm hoping this really gives you a good jump start to constructing the introduction for your capstone projects.